Okay, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm going to talk briefly to start with about what we mean by student engagement and the concept of students as partners, why we think it's particularly important, and then I'm going to hand over to Sarah to talk in much more detail about the work that we've been doing with Jisc and about the benchmarking tool itself. David teed this up quite nicely actually by talking about enhancement through partnership and working in partnership with students, and that's what I want to discuss in a bit more detail now. So, for those of you that haven't heard of the Student Engagement Partnership, we're funded by HESCE, Guild HE, AOC and the Association of Colleges, and we're housed by the National Union of Students. Our work is directed by a sector-wide steering group that's made up of our funders and lots of other bodies in the sector like Jisc and some representatives from institutions and students' unions. So in that sense, we're acting as a strategic partnership working across the English HE sector, trying to improve student engagement, knowledge and practice. But as I said, we're also an NUS House staff team that are doing projects, research, practitioner support through events and training. Just a quick question, I should probably have had an app for this, but we'll just do a show of hands. How many of you think that there is a shared understanding at your institution of the term student engagement? Yes? Put your hand up. Fantastic. Absolutely not. Put your hand up. And couldn't tell you, don't know. Okay, that's to be expected, I think. So there isn't one single definition of student engagement that we're all working under. Student engagement itself isn't kind of ill-defined, and I think you could probably say that it's potentially over-determined. But that it's incumbent upon us all locally to be thinking about what we mean by student engagement, what it means to us in our context, and what it is that we're trying to achieve. Potentially without this kind of sense of where we're going and this sense of a definition, we're not necessarily orienting students and staff towards some kind of shared idea of success. Ideally, that's something that will happen at an institutional level, will happen between the management of your institution and the students' union. They will set out maybe a shared vision or a sense of priorities for enhancement. But really, I think a lot of the stuff is quite bottom-up, and it might be incumbent upon you as practitioners to be thinking about what you mean by student engagement and what you're trying to achieve, and then sharing that with others. So what do I mean by student engagement then? Without kind of asserting a particular definition, what are some of the meanings that we might be thinking about? So I think definitions in the UK are necessarily set in context of quite an active culture of student unionism and an expectation that in most providers there is some level of representation of students, and that in most institutions this is very well embedded throughout the institution. So on the one hand, we've got an understanding of student engagement as being the level of investment that an individual makes in their education, about becoming a kind of successful autonomous learner. And I think we've also then got a slightly newer, more UK-specific definition, which is about student voice and about the ways in which students can influence their learning environment and enhance the quality of learning and teaching. So engagement in learning then, a whole body of literature that talks about student engagement in relation to learning as being associated with success, progression, retention, situating student engagement as a kind of individual investment in learning, but still with elements of partnership working with staff and with other students. And of course much of this literature and this work has led to improvements, thinking about high impact pedagogies and improvements in the way that individuals are enabled to learn best. But a student voice understanding of student engagement, there's much less of an evidence base associated with this kind of student engagement. It's often taken on the face of it as being a good thing, but we don't actually necessarily know what some of its benefits are. That's probably because a lot of the values that are associated with it, the values that underpin it, the things that we're trying to achieve, are more associated with things like democratic participation, civic outcomes, about trying to create more kind of open, participative institutions, the kinds of less tangible outcomes, if you like. You could also argue, I think, as well, that this kind of student voice or this kind of student engagement sends a more positive message about the other form of student engagement, about investment in learning. And you could also say that you'd have to have some level of investment in learning in order to want to enhance your learning and teaching as well, so they're essentially supporting each other. But I think because of this, in defining what we want to achieve by student engagement locally, we have to think about what are the values, our context-specific values that are underpinning it, and what are some of the less tangible outcomes that we think this work might be delivering, and how are we going to think about assessing and evaluating those. So, student engagement practices themselves are not new. The existence of student unions, course representation systems, but student engagement as a policy priority is actually relatively recent, although I think we're potentially seeing a shift backwards, I think, with some of the changes that have been announced in the white paper. But putting that aside, I think we have been, for the last few years, moving beyond thinking about the validity of these particular systems, so arguing whether or not you should have student unions or the validity of having representation, and instead thinking about some of the concepts that underpin these structures. And the concept of student as partners is one that has gained significant currency. So, as I've already said, partnership is derived from the insight that learning has to be a partnership, that the institution can put in all sorts of architecture around the learning experience, but ultimately it's the effort on behalf of students that will determine their success. Partnership then takes us a step further in saying that giving students a greater or equal responsibility for the decisions, policies and activities across the institution, and asking them to co-design, co-produce and co-evaluate their environment. It's also increasingly, I think, being referred to or best expressed as a culture of that exists within a higher education community, rather than something that you achieve. So not thinking of student engagement or student as partnership as an outcome in and of itself. So I'm sure we've all been there when we said, we got students in the room, we did it, we achieved student engagement. But what we're trying to seek here is that we engage people, we engage students in order to achieve educational change, in order to enhance the environment, not just because it's nice to have them there. So you would therefore expect student engagement, and we should be interrogating student engagement to make sure that it produces something, rather than just the kind of warm, fuzzy feelings of being in a room and having good conversations. So that's where we get to enhancement through partnership, and because the infrastructure for teaching and learning doesn't stand still, because there are constantly, I don't need to tell this room about innovation, because there is constant innovation, because there are new cohorts of students, we can be looking at ways that partnership can produce changes and enhancement that build a dynamic and an ever-evolving learning community. I've already said this idea as well about institutions and student unions having some kind of mutual accountability for this process of trying to orient students and staff where possible towards some kind of shared idea of success, but very much devolving practice to a local level, to the departments that you work in, to different faculties and different schools, to work out partnership activity in a way that works best for them, but to know what it is that you're striving towards and contributing to. And that's where I think we get to technology. Sarah's obviously going to talk about this in much more detail, but I think there are kind of three essential questions that we could be asking ourselves when it comes to student engagement in relation to technology-enhanced learning. So how can we be engaging students in ongoing conversations about their needs and expectations in relation to technology? How can we involve students in the design and the delivery of interventions, so not just what should this intervention look like, but how can we co-deliver it in partnership with students to both improve or extend the use of technology? And I think a newer area, and one that I think is particularly exciting but there hasn't been a huge amount of practice around, is how technology can actually be used to enable student voice, to extend the reach of opportunities to harder to reach groups of students so that they too can participate in enhancing their environment. Briefly, before I hand over to Sarah, I think there's quite a strong incentive when we're talking about student engagement and partnership to talk about it, but not necessarily to deliver on the promise of partnership. And that goes for institutions and student unions because it's difficult, it's quite political, it's very values driven, and it also talks potentially about handing over power, about redressing power imbalances. So as such, I think it's quite important to have some tests of authenticity, questions that we can ask ourselves about our own practice to see whether what we're saying we're doing is actually delivering on the promise of partnership. So these are just some suggestions. Has the process or activity been co-designed, or are students being asked to buy into an existing project? So are they involved right from the very start in identifying what the problem is and how it could be improved, or are they brought in to kind of rubber stamp something that you were kind of going to do already? Has there been some form of significant disagreement? I mean, you'd really hope so, because I can't believe that you could get a group of diverse staff and students in a room and they all just sit there and nod and agree. And if they do, perhaps it's not quite as robust as it should be. Has some thought been given to which cohorts of students are engaging or are more likely to engage, to make sure that we're ensuring that the basket of opportunities that we have for students to engage are accessible to lots of different students? Not all students are going to want to engage in enhancing their experience, but we should be trying to consider and address any barriers that might exist to them doing that. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, but there will be time for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. And that was really important, I think, scene setting in terms of introducing sort of my element, which is really talking about how we get a better understanding of our students' expectations and experiences of technology. Ellie very importantly mentioned partnership as a way that we can perhaps move our digital agendas forward within our institutions. And I think that's really an essential sort of foundation, really, for what my input's going to be speaking about. So I'm hoping to get you a little bit active now. We've all been sitting this morning, and what I'm hoping to do is we're just going to spend a few seconds speaking to the person next to you to share some ideas about your digital learners in your context. So what technology do your learners use every day or are using to support their learning? So just a quick few seconds sharing that with your partner, the people that are sat next to you, or in a little group if you're together. Okay, great. I'm glad to see that discussion happening. So did you talk about, did you have a good understanding of what technologies your learners were using? Just a quick show of hands, was that easy to do? Did you have a good understanding of knowing what technologies your learners are using in their everyday lives or within their learning environments? Quick show of hands, was that easy to do? Could you very accurately describe what technologies your learners were using? One or two show of hands there. Okay, that's great. Did you like the image on the screen? That was actually taken from one of our learner focus groups of a learner trying to use some blue tack to describe their digital self. And if you notice there, I did put draw, but as we're all in lecture theatre style, I didn't get you to start annotating. But I hope that was just useful, just to start thinking about what do we actually know about our learners' use of technology? Because thinking about the theme of today, if we're talking about digital capability for our staff, one of the most essential things to me, in my perspective, is knowing what skills I need as a member of staff to be able to support learners with the development of their digital skills. So a little bit of background. This work has been based around our Digital Student project, which has been running since 2013, and I know many of you in the room have been following the developments of that project. But it's given us a very, very valuable opportunity to speak to learners, thinking about the technologies that they are using in their everyday lives and how they are transferring those skills across in their learning and in the future in their digital workplace. So we've been very, very fortunate to speak to learners both from higher education, further education, and more recently, learners that are studying in what we call the skills sector, so adult community, work-based, apprenticeships, and offender learners. So very, very vast differences in what we are seeing in terms of learners' expectations around technology. You noticed that pyramid earlier that Ellie showed with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Wi-Fi at the bottom. Well, actually, that was probably one of the most common themes that came through across all those different groups of learners, that Wi-Fi is still a very, very important consideration. We tend to assume, well, innately, we've got that sorted. But actually, a lot of staff and students who we're speaking to were still saying, no, that is still a big issue for me in my institution. Just also to know, we've just started a study that's looking at online learners' expectations of the digital environment. We very much assume that learners are on campus, we can gain access to them, we've got the facilities on campus that they're using, but recognising that there's a growing percentage of students that are studying off campus, purely distance learning, that may never actually set foot on our campus or actually be in the UK. And very important that we have an understanding of how online learners are experiencing the digital environment and what skills and confidence they have in using the online platforms that we might be developing for them. So I think what we have learned across our studies to date is that often students' first experiences of our organisations are often online. We are starting to see universities comparing their digital experience and provision. Many course experiences are now blended. And importantly, we're starting to see that blend of institutional versus personally owned devices. I'm actually very grateful to UCISA because the original brief for this project was developed out of a co-design working group that involved representation from UCISA. As IT directors were saying, we want to be able to plan and future-proof our provision, but we don't know what our learners are expecting. So the whole sort of premise of this project was very much down to yourselves, really, in instigating this work. The importance of preparing our learners for the digital workplace and that sense of well-being. As you may have noticed in James, when James presented the digital capability framework, there is an element in there around digital well-being. And that equally applies both to staff and students, that we are able to support ourselves and our students with knowing when to go offline, when to have that balance between being online 24/7, what the barriers are, and of course wrapped up in there as well as all the issues around online safety, which perhaps might not be so significant for higher education, although I will show you some stats in a moment in terms of what learners are saying in relation to that. As we heard from Ellie, students do want to be involved. This is not just about surveying students once a year to get their views. This is about an ongoing dialogue that informs the way in which your digital environment is being created and developed. What opportunities do your students have to get engaged, to share their views, and to be active participants in the development? I know there are some excellent examples of practice in this room and in the wider community where students are working on partnership projects relating from the digital infrastructure through to developing the curriculum and curriculum design, through to supporting more innovative ways of student induction. Some fantastic examples of practice out there. We really need to harness the innovation skills of our students to put that into practice. This also is an issue that can help change relationships between staff and students. When we're talking about developing our staff digital capability, how many of you in the room are using students to support your staff with the development of their skills? Quick show of hands. Great to see that happening. We're starting to see students being far more active in terms of their roles as digital champions, digital ambassadors, the ways that they are supporting help desks both for staff and students. So let's really empower and work in partnership to do that. Now, I have set up a Padlet, and I'm hoping those of you that are online and have got the Wi-Fi to work will be able to add your comments and reflections to the Padlet throughout today, because I think it's really important that we start to sort of harness the power of the ideas and the creative thinking that's going on in this room today over the next 2 days. A quick show of hands here. How many of you gather your students' expectations and experiences within your institutions and have methods and approaches to do that on a regular basis? Okay, so a few hands going up. Thank you. Taking that one step further, how many of you have opportunities for your students to get engaged and contribute to the development of your institution's digital strategy? Okay, even less hands going up now. Thank you. I think that that's probably representative of where we are in the sector at the moment. I think there are pockets of excellent practice that are happening, but there isn't perhaps an established way or established opportunities, I think, for institutions to harness the power that may be there to gather those views and those opportunities to engage students in discussions around the digital environment. An example to bring from further education, where students have been quite actively involved in presenting to to college governors, where they are actually selling the benefits of what digital means to them. Recently, through all the consultation work we've been doing around our digital student events, we said to staff, this goes across HEFE and skills, what would really help you sell the benefits of digital to your staff, so that staff are then wishing to develop their digital capability skills and wanting to embrace digital in a more holistic way. And the response we got back was case studies. I thought, great, we've got a whole bank of case studies, there you go. And the response was back, actually no, we want case studies of learners actually speaking about their use of technology, how it's impacting on them, what the benefits have been to them in their experience, and how potentially it's helped them be more prepared for going out into the digital workplace. So we currently are producing some digital learner stories, which I hope will share the diversity of ways in which technology can support and enhance students' experience. So current practice, and I'm hoping that those of you in the room that you will recognise some of these techniques that are happening. And this might not necessarily be across the whole institution, but you may have pockets of this practice happening in different elements. Certainly we're seeing libraries as being very active centres of engaging students and being sort of a hub really for students to access support in relation to their digital skills and digital literacies. We've got their sort of informal feedback. That can be just as important as the formal sort of institutional surveys. Those of you that are aware, National Student Survey, is undergoing some changes. Potentially there is talk of an optional set of questions that could be added into that survey, focusing on technology-enhanced learning. We've been trying to work with the consultation process to feed in some ideas around that. Because currently there is very little reference to technology in those surveys. So we do want to do this better. It is challenging. It's also very difficult to look at that longitudinal view in terms of being able to monitor how students' voices and expectations are changing year on year. But it very much should be part of the change agenda when we're talking about the holistic vision that James mentioned earlier in relation to organisational digital capability. We really need to be making sure that we have got in there ways in which and mechanisms in there that are robust enough to be able to give us the data that we require to make the decisions in taking forward our sort of digital strategies. So I'd like to sort of introduce and share with you, and I'm going to just ask for a quick poll of anyone in the room who has been part of our institutional pilot for our digital student experience tracker. Great, thank you, Phil. Thank you. Yes, we've been working over the past 6 months to pilot a set of questions that have been developed around our digital student work, which we can use with institutions as a standard set of questions to gather learners' expectations and experiences of technology. We've used BOSS as a survey system to deliver the question sets, and we have been able to gather evidence from our students on their expectations and experiences of technology, to then allow institutions to identify key issues, areas for development, to take forward that ongoing dialogue and those next steps of engagement. So from that tracker process, we've gathered nearly 11,000 student responses from 24 pilot institutions. That has been overwhelming, really, to see that interest and the approaches that institutions have used to encourage students to participate. And I think the process is as much as important as the actual results that we've been getting. So some interesting stats on here. Now, the report from the project is going to be released formally next week, so there will be a report with the headlines as well as some analysis around this. But some really interesting numbers, I think, already coming up there. We've got a high percentage of students that can access materials, but interesting to note, only 27% of students said they were told how their personal data is stored and used by institutions. Now, thinking about the emphasis on learning analytics and the move towards more data-driven mechanisms and metrics, that sort of identifies quite a big issue in terms of being able to sort of engage students more in the process around that area. And very briefly, in relation to learning and teaching, some interesting statistics coming back in relation to how students are engaging with the different technologies that they are being exposed to. Again, high percentage using working online, but when it comes down to perhaps recording, reflecting, developing a record of their own learning, that percentage sort of drops quite considerably. But I think very pleasing to see that 71% of students really agree their learning experience is helped when technology is used effectively by teaching staff. So those are just some of the headline stats, more to follow next week. Now, I'm hoping when you walked in, you got a copy of the Digital Student Benchmarking Guide that was sat on the front desk. If you have, get it out from your packs and just have that in front of you. There are copies on the front registration desk, so if you haven't received one, please do get one at the lunch break. But what we have been working on with NUS and Ellie and the Student Engagement Partnership is to try and pull together some key principles for designing an effective digital experience for your students. So we've pulled together a set of good practice principles using the template that NUS have used previously for their benchmarking guides, and tried to look at the steps that you would need to take to enable an effective digital experience for your students. So you'll see as you sort of move across, you go from first steps, which is sort of initiating that activity, whether it be in relation to induction, whether it be about developing and designing the curriculum or digital well-being, moving across to outstanding provision. And where we've got outstanding, throughout those points that are listed down there, they all make reference to working in partnership with students as being active contributors to that activity. So you can use the tool at different levels. It's being used at a department level, it's being used in service areas, for example libraries, or the whole institution, and some institutions have been referring to it as a useful tool and guide to support their QAA reviews if they are using digital literacy as one of the review themes. So lots of ideas on how to use it. It's also a useful tool to open up dialogue with your students' union. It's very important to consider the range of stakeholders that you should be having discussions around in this area. So it's a tool for starting discussions, and it really can be a helpful guide to start, perhaps as a checklist against your digital strategy in terms of, are we addressing all these areas? How are students engaging? How are we feeding student views into these different areas as well? So we probably haven't got time to do this now, but if you could have a look at that tool over the course of the next 2 days and share your feedback through the Padlet, that would be fantastic. I have tweeted the Padlet link, and it would be really nice to get some ideas sharing in terms of how you might think about using this tool to support your own practice and to support the development and the engagement of your students with their digital skills and capabilities, and more importantly, have a better understanding of your students' needs and expectations in relation to the digital. I always like to end my sessions with giving you one particular thought to take away. And from what you've just heard from both Ellie and myself, I would like to challenge you to share back with me using a text wall. If you haven't used a text wall before, very simple. You're able to send a text to the number that's on the screen, starting your text with Digi, and those responses will get captured in our text wall, and we'll be able to display those on a website page which lists all those texts back and the feedback back. So what one thing can you do to gather your students' digital expectations of experiences effectively in your context? So thank you, and I'm not sure if we've got any time for questions, but there may be a few minutes for Ellie.
Yeah. Thanks very much to Sarah and Ellie. So. I think we can squeeze in a couple of questions before lunch, if anybody wants to.
Hi, this is Brian Irwin from Sheffield Hallam University. I had a question, I think specifically for Ellie, which was around one of the challenges we've faced has been students perhaps coming and going quite a lot faster than our staff members, and how you extend partnership beyond, different student union officers, different people, because we've had some times where we've got really good engagement from some people, and they've really helped set that agenda. There's been a big change. Somebody comes in and goes, well, this isn't what I want, and they just kind of didn't engage at all. And it was kind of, how can we maybe best do things like that?
Yeah. So I think there's a few things there. For those of you that have active students' unions and who you either have a very good relationship or you'd like to build a good relationship, I'd encourage you obviously to speak to elected officers, but also to build relationships with staff and students' unions as well. The majority of higher education students' unions anyway have full-time staff members working to support elected officers who provide a bit more of that kind of continuity experience over time, and will be very keen, I think, to develop those relationships. Although anecdotally we do know as well that lots of those staff don't have the kind of relationships with educational developers or learning technologists where they could really benefit from it. So I'd say that is one suggestion. I think we're really seeing as well an evolution away from it just being about students' unions and representatives, but there being a real kind of ecosystem almost of student engagement within institutions. So things like students as researchers schemes. The Jisc Change Agents Network is a really good starting point to have a look at some of that practice. And we have seen that a lot of those schemes aren't just kind of imposed at a top level across the institution. They often actually start within a department or in a service, and that's where students are recruited, yes, but then trained and supported, and often work in partnership with staff to identify either particular problems that they would like to investigate and then go out and research that, or to kind of do qualitative research about students' views on a particular issue and then come back together to think about what some of the next steps might be. I think things like utilising surveys is really important, although, as Sarah said, I think surveys can use students' voices without necessarily engaging students' voices. So involving students, if you have surveys that you run and you send out to students, inviting a group of students to help co-design that survey, to think about what questions they would include, bringing together a group to analyse the survey results and think about what they might mean and what the next steps are, utilising focus groups. So I think the main message that I would say is that ideally there would be a basket of opportunities that would exist. They don't all have to run through the Students' Union, but where possible, I think involving them can open up new opportunities. And that once you've got those opportunities in place, then you're really looking at, like you say, the types of students that are engaging and where some of the gaps might be and how that can be extended.
Yes, and just to add to that, we've got a conference next week that we're running in partnership with the University of Lincoln. We've got 200 staff and students coming together to share their experiences of partnership working, and that goes across a whole range of different institutional activities. So there are some really great examples here, not to embarrass Phil, but Phil Vincent's project, pilot for the Digital Student Tracker, has involved student researchers working with him and his team to analyse and support the process. So we've got some nice examples of practice happening.
I'll just flag a particular project as well that we're quite excited about, that we're working on with Liz Thomas Associates at the moment on commuter student engagement, because we've really found that they're a group that has lots of different kind of intersecting barriers. So lots of mature students, parents are also commuter students, but I think they're also a group of students who are seemingly sort of on campus. They're not necessarily they're not distance learners, but they're only there for a very short period of time, very specific period of time, and they can fall through the net. So those outcomes from that project will be released soon if that's of particular interest.